Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that has been on my 2022 TBR, so I'm glad to finally check that off the list. It is a book that is about pilots in World War II and contradictory rules. I am referring to Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which was published in 1961. For those who don't know, and I have a feeling that this is one of the authors that I talk about that a fair amount of people might know, or at least know of his works. Joseph Heller was an American author who lived throughout the 1900s. Is mostly known for writing Catch-22, although he wrote quite a bit of other things as well. What's interesting is that Catch-22 is the first thing he wrote. And I enjoyed this story, spoiler alert for when I talk about it later. What's interesting is that, if this is where he's starting, I would also like to see where he ends up. A common refrain on this channel where I talk about, the first thing an author writes as compared to later works. It's not always the case that early work is a great indicator of success with later work. But if this is where you're starting out, imagine where you might be when you hone your craft. I just think that's pretty fascinating. Joseph Heller was also a bombardier, an airplane pilot during World War II, which is interesting because that is exactly what Catch-22 is kind of about. So maybe it's a little bit about him writing about his own experiences during the time, before later becoming an author and getting his degree in literature or something like that. So without further ado, let's talk about Catch-22. I'll do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Catch-22 focuses on a group of fighter pilots on the island of Pianosa, somewhere off the coast of Italy, during World War II. The story focuses on all of them, a bunch of different pilots, a bunch of different characters, and the top brass and all the servicemen. But I would say there is a protagonist, and his name is Yossarian. Yossarian is constantly a couple of missions away from being able to go home, but the top brass, for one reason or another, keep raising the number of missions, and Yossarian is slowly losing it, along with the other fighter pilots, as they're being made to continually fly missions that might result in their death, and the top brass, the people in charge, don't seem to care. And at the same time, the military brass are using the rule Catch-22 as a means of keeping people continuing to do the mission. Catch-22 being that if a fighter pilot wants to fly, they're deemed insane and they won't be able to fly. But if they don't want to fly, that means they're sane and they have to continue flying. But the interesting thing is, even if they're deemed insane, because of Catch-22 again, the top brass aren't going to send them home because they need bodies to fly the planes to do the flight missions. And so no matter what, you're always going to be asked to fly more missions, no matter how insane or crazy or how tired you are, which certainly puts a lot of stress on these men as they begin dying and as they contend with where they want to be in this war. And one of the people who keep raising the number of missions is Colonel Ketchard, I believe his name is, who really seems to hate Yossarian for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Another character in this story is Major, or as his full name is Major. His father really wanted to name him Major, apparently. He seems to engage in a lot of shenanigans, forging the name Washington Irving on letters and censoring letters as well, threatening people if they try to talk to him while he's in the office, and also climbing out of his window to avoid doing any actual work at the office. He seems to disappear at several points throughout the story, and kind of highlighting how nobody really wants to do any work during this war. Yossarian tries to get out of a number of missions, and also things go wrong so that he has to end up doing those missions anyways. And at the same time, he also has conversations where he doubts either the existence of God or the existence of a competent God. At the same time, there's the character Milo Minderbinder, who is also engaging in what I can only call shenanigans through this story. He's actually forging a capitalist system throughout this war, going so far as to become the mayor of a small town, and heading up a syndicate where he basically sells things on a black market, and also creates its own economy that relies on him, and also relies on him sabotaging the pilots on Pianosa, which results in a few deaths, and also results in the island being bombed in order to contribute to the economy and also make good on some contracts that he has, especially with the enemy. At one point, Yossarian gets wounded in the story, but still has to fly, unfortunately. A lot of the other people have problems with bombing populated villages, even though the brass are like, oh, well, we're not going to tell them because that would interfere with our ability to destroy a convoy that might be coming through. One other pilot, McWatt, just straight up kills himself by flying into the side of a mountain, which results in a few other people dying as well, including the character Doc Danica, who doesn't actually die, but is mistakenly labeled as dead, even though everyone can still see him. And because of this, he loses his access to his pay. He can't make use of rations, and his wife just assumes that all letters coming from him are from a prankster, and she just moves away. So Doc Danica kind of loses a lot throughout all of this. Another character who is close to Yossarian named Nately dies, which deeply upsets the prostitute that he was dating and fell in love with, and she tries to kill Yossarian as a result throughout the rest of the story. And this also sends Yossarian kind of spiraling because he really liked Nately. They were great friends, and it was like one of the few things connecting him to like reality and not like just leaving him in absolute despair. And as Yossarian walks through Rome a short while later, he sees the chaos in Rome, truly understanding like the scope of what war is like. Even if people aren't fighting, like there's still the American brass, the American soldiers are kind of running roughshod, and it's not a pretty picture. Yossarian at this point decides he's not going to fly any more missions, and he tells everyone that the top brass, including the colonels, decide at this point that they have to give Yossarian a promotion. It's either accept a promotion or be court-martialed, and in order to get the promotion, he has to tell everyone that he likes the colonels. They yearn to be liked, apparently, and Yossarian decides that he's not really sure if he wants to do that because it would be lying, and it also let the other servicemen down who view him as sort of an anti-hero at this point who's rebelling against the system. And as the story ends, he decides to run away, with the implication being that he's going to be pursued for quite some time because he did reject the system. In terms of analysis, Heller provides us with a lot to think about. I was constantly like shifting my thoughts on this story because it's incredibly funny, very comical. One of the funniest stories I ever read, and I had to wonder, was like any of that intentional? And I do think it is intentional because it couldn't be this funny without Heller at least trying to make it funny. But at the same time, it's incredibly dark, and I feel those two things clash. But I also think that that's Heller's point, that by making them clash, you're like, why am I laughing at this? Why am I laughing at this terrifying situation which happens in reality? So I think Heller is really good at mixing humor and dark moments in this story. And another theme that he really works on here is absurdism, spreading it throughout the story. He takes the already bizarre situation of World War II, of Americans, of people in wartime, and takes it even further to the extreme to make a series of absurd situations of Yossarian trapped in this absurdist kind of hell where nobody really is really competent at what they're doing. Like everything seems to be against him, and it's too comical to really be angry about, but it's also like a rejection of the serious, of the urgency of the moment, because they're in the middle of World War II. They're fighting against Germany, Italy, Japan, and here's all these weird, bizarre situations that that only seem to highlight that the people in charge don't know what they're doing. There's prostitute assassins. There's Major going out of his way to forge letters in Washington Irving's name for some reason. And he's also shirking his responsibilities. He doesn't really want to engage in his job, which frustrates various other characters. And then there's the, like, what I can only assume are sort of CID agents, which I think are kind of like military police who are working against each other and don't seem to know that mutual investigations are going on. And I feel like there's a good quote that really highlights the situation. Allow me to read it to you. "Yes," said Yossarian, "he poisoned the squadron. Milo went pale again. He did what? He mashed hundreds of cakes of GI soap into the sweet potatoes just to show that people have the taste of Philistines and don't know the difference between good and bad. Every man in the squadron was sick. Missions were canceled." "Well," Milo exclaimed with thin-lipped disapproval, "he certainly found out how wrong he was, didn't he?" "On the contrary," Yossarian corrected, "he found out how right he was. We packed it away by the plateful and clamored for more. We all knew we were sick, but we had no idea we'd been poisoned." And I find that to be a very funny quote, like in a series of very funny situations in this story, but kind of highlighting the absurd in this time of war that the military chef would poison all these people because they didn't think that servicemen understood the value of fine dining or whatnot. And it turns out the chef was exactly right. They couldn't tell the difference between poison food and high quality food. And that's kind of like a very interesting way to highlight the absurd situations that happen in war, of all these characters cracking and just doing the absolute worst to one another. It highlights the insanity of the military. It highlights the insanity of war, and it also illustrates the folly of bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is harming several people in this story by assuming that one person is dead even though they're still there, by sending people on countless war or missions even though they might have completed the number of missions that they have to do. And like Colonel Ketchart is obsessed with being the colonel that sends his crew on the most missions, so to the point where he wants to get a medal for it and look good and possibly get promoted. And that's really ridiculous because it comes at the cost of the pilots' lives and their own sanity. And that's not even covering like how absurd Catch-22 is. The idea that if you aren't sane, like you can't fly any more missions, but the only way to not be sane is to want to fly more missions. And if you don't want to fly more missions, that means you have to fly more missions. And it's kind of circular logic. You see a lot of that in this story with characters saying, why can't we do something? And the top brass saying, because XYZ. And they're like, why is XYZ the case? And they're like, oh, because you can't do that. And not really giving a good answer and just highlighting how absurd the bureaucracy is. You have that idea of the theater of the absurd or something like that, like the Embracing the Absurd by Albert Camus. But I think the characters in the story can't embrace the absurd because if they try to embrace it, and they might get killed at the same time. Like those doing the absurd things that they can't really embrace are the ones who are putting their lives in the most danger. And I think that's a really interesting theme to work with here. And I think it really helps sell like the horror that is involved in this story. Another idea that Heller is working with here is that of incompetence. like how the military brass is incapable of doing their jobs. As I noted before, like they send people on missions that they don't want to complete. They themselves refuse to go on those missions. They can't seem to accurately punish people because anytime they try to, like someone comes along and says, "Oh, you can't deliver that kind of punishment." They can't tell that Yossarian is pretending to be sick to get out of actually doing missions. And at the end, like instead of punishing Yossarian, they're just like, "Oh, if you tell everyone we're good, we'll let you go home, and we'll even promote you in the process." That's kind of incompetent because they can't get people to like them by doing a good job. They have to bribe them with more money and with a position of high reputation. But I think it's also that they not so much that they can't do their jobs, they might also be unwilling to do their jobs because they themselves don't want to fly those missions, and also by doing their job, like they're reminded of the horrors of war, of the fact that they're sending people to their death. And I think that's a lot of the reason why Major, like why he doesn't want to like be in his office. He doesn't want to talk to anyone because he's going to just be reminded of all the terrible things that are going on. And so he threatens people if they talk to him about their job. So the top, not only are the top brass like incapable of doing their jobs, they wouldn't even do it if they could do their jobs. And I think that's a really damning of the military, but also highlighting how like maybe nobody is prepared for war. And it seems like not only is a military incompetent here, but as Heller also notes, God themselves, however you choose to refer to God, like God is an incompetent being. There's another fascinating quote that I would like to read to you. "And don't tell me God works in mysterious ways," Yossarian continued, hurtling on over her objection. "There's nothing so mysterious about it. He's not working at all. He's playing, or else he's forgotten all about us. That's the kind of God you people talk about. A country bumpkin, a clumsy, bungling, brainless, conceited, uncouth hayseed. Good God, how much reverence can you have for a supreme being who finds it necessary to include such phenomena as phlegm and tooth decay in his divine system of creation?" And that's a really fascinating quote because it's so negative towards the idea of a higher power, that usually during war we call upon God to like deliver us and save the ones that we love. But here's here's Heller saying basically that God is bad at his job. Like he's not as all powerful as we think he is. He's just bumbling around. He created humans, and that maybe that was a mistake, or not a mistake, but that was an accident in and of itself. And that God really doesn't have the power to affect positive change, and everything is awful as a result. I think a lot of that is guided by what Heller might have seen during World War II, or what the characters themselves are seeing, that how can you believe in a just and powerful God if so many people are dying? Like God should theoretically be able to prevent this, and they haven't. And so that only assumes that, much like the top brass, God is just an incompetent, horrible being, like not really out for anyone's positive benefit. It's an incredibly nihilistic way to view God, because if you see God as this way, if you see the top brass as this way, like the higher power and the authority figures acting like this, like what's the point of trying? Like what's the point of doing anything in this war? I think at another point they call into question patriotism too, and it's like nothing kind of matters, or why engage in all that effort if like a higher power is just gonna mess things up, if the authority figures are incapable of running anything as well. You're out of luck ultimately. And Heller also works with a number of other interesting ideas in this story. He talks about Washington Irving a little bit, because the characters are forging letters with his name on it attached in some way as they're censoring those letters. And I think that's fascinating, because if you consider the history of the United States and the mythos of the United States, like Washington Irving contributed to a lot of that, including the idea of George Washington and chopping down the cherry tree and all of that. And a lot of that didn't happen. Like it's very clear that Washington Irving just made up a bunch of myths at times about the United States. And I think that's what that's what Heller's getting at here, where like we created a lot of myths about World War II and how we were a finely tuned machine, and here's Heller saying no, we actually weren't. That was a myth. Everyone involved is a little bit incompetent, and people died because of this incompetence. And I don't think he's trying to get at that point specifically, but there is an argument to be made. Besides, it's really too specific of a name to be using anything but like Washington Irving. So I think that's a little bit intentional there. You could also make an argument that Heller is arguing against capitalism, or is trying to point out the bad side of allowing capitalism to run rampant in war, because it often results in one side like engaging in or it often results in the capitalists themselves pitting two sides against each other in order to make a profit, which we see a lot of today with gun companies and defense industries selling arms to both sides and causing harm so that those sides will again purchase more weaponry. And that's what happens with Milo Minderbinder here. He's engaging in a kind of capitalism on both sides of the war, so much so that it causes him to bomb his own people, and it's all being done so he can stick to contracts and make a little bit of extra money, and people are dying as a result. So I think Heller's making an argument against capitalism, or at least capitalism during wartime. And then there's also the stories of Snowden and Doc. I don't have much to say about that, but their stories are pretty dark, with Doc's family pretty much just moving on without him, and the system just presuming that he's dead. And Snowden standing out as like this dark island in a sea of comedy, where like it doesn't really describe the violence too much in this story, but Snowden is pretty much described as getting shot while he's in the plane and his guts spilling out, and it's one of the darker elements of the story, and I think it's meant to be a crescendo, because that's mentioned multiple points through the story before it just reaches its peak at the very end. So I have to say, like, Heller does a really good job of presenting horror through Doc and Snowden. There's only one thing I'd complain about in this story, and I think that's how it kind of drags on at times. How it like 250 pages in or so, I'm like, okay, I get this. Why is there still so much more? Like, he focuses on a bunch of different stories, but it just feels like it's dragging out. And like after a certain point, like the comedy just becomes redundant. And it's like, you've already told us some of this. You already used some of these stories. You already used this kind of comedy, and so it just feels like you're just repeating yourself at this point. And I feel like it could have done with like cutting a huge chunk of it out. And I don't think he would have lost too much out of it, but I still think that would have helped improve the story in some way. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. A really solid book. I didn't know that I was going to enjoy this as much as I thought I did, and I thought it was a really solid book, especially for one that's satirical, anti-war. I think it does what it does pretty solidly. It's pretty effective in getting its message across without hammering you over the head too much, which I feel a lot of anti-war stories have that issue. But if you read this before, or you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about Catch-22. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Joseph Heller if they don't already know. And Catch-22, which I feel a lot of people might know, just because it's one of those well-regarded stories, and also there's a couple of adaptations of it out there, including a Hulu TV series which has George Clooney in it. Otherwise, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and piloty travels. Farewell.